Hello, everyone, and welcome to How Much Greener is the Grass? My name is Dr. Adam R. Cebulski. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am the CEO and founder of transform.forward, a change management strategy consulting and executive coaching agency. My background spans higher education, corporate consulting, and innovative technology, and I've dedicated my career to helping individual institutions and their leaders thrive. I've also been in your shoes, having served most recently on a campus in dual roles as a chief of staff and assistant vice president for student engagement and success. Higher education loves a long title. I still remain active in the field by teaching, researching, and publishing, and actively participating in professional associations. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Want to make sure everyone knows how to use the platform. This session will be recorded and made available on our website and YouTube for future viewing. You're also welcome to comment during this session, and we'll attempt to address as we're able, and we'll make sure there's dedicated time at the end for questions. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to give you a little bit of background to this session, the whole month, as well as why we're doing what we're doing here. And so while October has traditionally been celebrated as Careers in Student Affairs Month, we've observed a growing interest in roles beyond the campus. So in a lighthearted pivot, we've introduced Careers Outside of Student Affairs Month. This isn't meant to be shady toward the original month, but instead highlight how you can still support students off campus or use the skills you honed as a student affairs practitioner in other fields. This month was designed for you and with you. Hundreds of you liked and commented on social media posts suggesting the topics. That's even how we recruited some of our speakers. We're excited about this direction and are considering extending discussions beyond just October. But now, let's get to the folks that you're here to engage with. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our speakers. And today, we're really diving into a conversation that's close to, I think, a lot of our hearts who have left higher education, and it's the perfect way to kick off the month. Transitioning out of higher education isn't just a switch, it's a conscious choice and a journey. I'll let the speakers more formally introduce themselves, but I wanted to give you a little insight into how this session came about. I worked with Lindsey for almost 8 years at SMU, and she was a direct report of mine during most of that time. When Lindsey moved on from SMU, her absence was deeply felt, not just for her professional contributions, but really for the spirit that she brought every day. I loved the way that she would challenge me, and I eagerly watched as she stepped into her next chapter. She isn't just a direct report, but had become a friend. And I actually met Justin through a tag on one of our social media posts, and we met to discuss his participation. I was really impressed by his ability to articulate his story, his passion for wanting to help others navigate this same journey that he went on. And I'm so incredibly appreciative of both Lindsey and Justin being willing to share their stories, the triumphs, the setbacks, and the lessons learned. This promises to be a candid look into life beyond the campus. So let's dive in.
Hello.
So Lindsey, Justin, thank you both so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you coming on to talk about and to tell your stories. For the majority of this conversation, I'm going to take a step back and turn it over to both of you, but I will help monitor the chat so you can both focus on the dialogue. So really to kick it all off, I'd love for you all to share a little bit about your journey and really what was your last role within higher education?
Justin, I'll let you start. Kick us off.
Oh, thanks, Lindsey. Well, first off, thank you all for being here and hanging out with the three of us today. I really appreciate the opportunity. And I actually started in higher ed a very long time ago. And it was one of those things where I thought I was going to be in this role for 6 months. I thought, you know what? I'm going to be here for 6 months and then I'm going to move on to something else. It's a great stepping stone. That role back in 2007 was the Recreation and Intramurals Coordinator. From 2007 until last year, 2021, I ended up on the same campus. I worked for Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, and I had every student-facing role imaginable. I, again, started as that Recreation and Intramural Coordinator. And when I left, I was the executive director of community outreach and engagement. In between that span, literally every student facing role that one can imagine. I was the director of the student engagement office for a few years. I was a project manager for all of our student engagement initiatives and just spent a lot of time on campus. I never expected to be in higher ed for 14 years. And here we are. So I have since transitioned out of higher ed, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but it was such a great experience. I learned so much and realized that, you know what, it might be time to try some other things and see what else is out there. So again, we'll talk about that in a bit, but I'm going to kick it over to Lindsey now.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, thinking all the way back, it is a long way back. I was in higher ed for a little over 15 years, and I started working back for my alma mater. So I worked for my undergrad institution and actually started working professionally at that institution even before I graduated, which was a little crazy. So I got the chance to start a student activities program. I did my undergrad at a small private in West Texas, Hardin-Simmons University, and there was just a lot of need for developing out the student affairs experience for students. We didn't have a formal student activities program, and that was a long time ago, but not so long ago that there should not have already been a student activities program. So we were behind the times a little, but it was a really great opportunity to get to build and start learning about what it meant to work in higher ed. And I learned pretty quickly that while I liked working within a higher ed framework, I really loved working with student leaders. And so got to cut my teeth, if you will, building student leader boards and kind of thinking about what a student center should look like and doing some renovations. And so went from there to the University of Houston in Victoria. So I moved there right after getting married. So I didn't move to that place for my job necessarily, which is something that's pretty common in higher ed, is moving around to follow different job opportunities. But I actually just got married and moved to where my new husband lived and got an opportunity to continue working in higher ed. And so I was working for the University of Houston in Victoria as the director of student life. And we were, that institution was undergoing a lot of change. So they were part of the University of Houston system, and we were figuring out what it meant to add residential students to a campus that had never had residential students before. And so really got to learn a lot about building, about being part of a multi-site institution. And so a lot of learning went on there, and then made my way to Dallas. I had started a doctorate program after completing a master's in adult and higher education at the University of Houston in Victoria, and wanted to continue pursuing education, and was so thankful to find the opportunity to study leadership studies, which was my favorite thing to think about and learn about. Again, I all the way back loved working with those student leaders. And so I was back at my alma mater doing my doctorate program and wanted to get geographically a little bit closer. And so found my way to SMU, where I was for almost 10 years. Started out really focusing on the orientation office. Orientation had always been part of what I had done, but at UHV I did orientation and conduct and student government and kind of the full array, student residence life, all sorts of things. So I kind of got the opportunity to continue using that orientation muscle and really focusing on that at SMU. And then eventually my office and my portfolio grew to where I had leadership programs and parent and family programs, all focusing on all things that are important to students and their families. And so my last role at SMU was the director of the Office of the Student Experience. And yeah, had all sorts of opportunities to learn all about higher ed and all the ways that it can be an exciting and an amazing career, and one that, yeah, all along the way I kept thinking, I'm just still part of higher ed. I still love it, and I'm still here.
Thank you. So obviously, earlier I mentioned that leaving higher education is a choice, and you have to be making that active choice. And there's a lot of work that goes into that transitioning out. Can you walk us through a little bit? What were each of your thought processes and decision making and main factors ultimately to help you make the decision to leave higher education?
I can go first this time, Justin. I'll do
Go
it.
for it, Lindsey.
Yeah. So for me, I think it was kind of twofold. As Adam said, he and I had the opportunity to work together, and we had built some programs, and I'd found myself in kind of a new realm within our specific student affairs division at SMU, and we had built out kind of two programs, part of our strategic planning program to kind of transform the ways that students interacted on campus, as well as a first year experience program that would be something that would eventually fall under me. And both of those were really large programs, and kind of I saw those as my professional path to continued growth and opportunity. I was really excited about those. And both of those projects ultimately ended up not being adopted by the university. And there were lots of reasons for those. And I never felt angry about that. It was a lot of work that went into them. We piloted programs. We believed in those programs. But as happens on higher ed institutions, there were other factors, COVID being one. We haven't said COVID yet. How is that possible? But COVID was a huge factor in kind of changing some of the paths and ways that we were going to approach some of the institutional goals. And so those kind of path forward projects ultimately ended in kind of dead ends. And so there was kind of a professional point where realizing that I may have reached a turning point professionally in student affairs and at SMU, while also welcoming children to our family. So we were married a really long time before adding children to our family, and brought our first little one home with us in 2020, which was just a very normal time to do anything, especially adding a child to your life. And so I was on maternity leave in the middle of 2020, and kind of came back to what felt like a whole different campus, a whole different job. So much had changed, both on campus in my professional life, and absolutely in our personal life. And so I really realized that there were some different ways I wanted to work, and I wanted to explore the ability to be home more, the ability to be a little bit more flexible and available for our family that just kept growing, because we also welcomed another little one to our family just the next year. So we have two really small children, and I think that desire to explore opportunities to be more flexible was one of the biggest factors in feeling like while there was a change in my professional life at SMU and in higher ed, I also wanted to explore what it would be like to work in some different ways. So started exploring opportunities to make a change.
Yeah, and Lindsey, my path is similar, and I don't want to blame it specifically on COVID, but I think I reached a point at Jefferson where I just felt like I had plateaued, and I didn't really feel like there was anywhere else for me to go. And I had a great relationship with our provost, and we had kind of an awkward conversation one day, and this was pre-pandemic. And he said, "Oh, Justin, you're really doing a great job for Jefferson and for our campus and our students. You could just keep doing what you're doing for the next 20 years, and no one would ever bother you." And I fully believe he was trying to be nice when he said that. But for me, it was one of those really eye-opening experiences where I thought to myself, if I'm still doing this same thing in 20 years and there hasn't been any sort of professional growth involved in my career, then that's not something that's going to be very fulfilling to me. Well, that was right before the pandemic. And then the pandemic hit. And obviously in higher ed, I don't have to stress what a goofy time that was for everybody, because no one knew what to do. And I think because everything was remote, Jefferson was looking for jobs for people to do. And somehow I was put in charge of contact tracing for our entire organization. Now, everybody knows what contact tracing is now, but nobody knew what it was back in March of 2020. So I ended up immersing myself in all things contact tracing. And within about a week, we had a full team of contact tracers up and running and creating all the reports that needed to be created, and making sure that we're communicating with the health department and the state and all that. So it was one of those things where I found, although it was really stressful and very difficult, it was something that I found so much fulfillment in. And then I guess because I was doing a good job with contact tracing, they said, "Well, Justin, we're gonna tap your community partnerships, and we want you to start working with your partners to come up with ideas and ways we can distribute this vaccine more effectively for some of our community partners. So I ended up then putting some vaccine clinics together at places like the Philadelphia School District, various locations. And it was another one of those things where I thought, there's got to be someone at Jefferson more equipped or more knowledgeable to put in charge of this. But it was one of those things that ultimately I was very thankful for and found a lot of enjoyment doing. Well, then as the pandemic started waning, they said, well, Justin, we're going to scale back some of the stuff that you had been doing, some of that really exciting, really fun stuff where you were collaborating with all departments across campus and the hospital and working with our community partners. And they said, well, we kind of just want you to focus on your day-to-day. And I said, that's just not something I think I want to go back to. I've been so busy and found so much enjoyment doing these other things. I don't really want to go back to doing that day to day. And the remote aspect of it, of course, was a huge sticking point for me because I grew very accustomed to remote work during that time. And I thought, I don't know if I could ever go back into an office full time. And, one thing led to another. And in early 2022, I ended up leaving higher ed.
I have a question for Justin that I'm curious if he had a similar experience as I did. And I wonder if those even contemplating a move from higher ed may have had a similar question. During my time in higher ed, I think there was a point where there were lots of jobs and lots of professionals that I looked up to and thought, I could do these jobs someday, or maybe that'll be a role that I have. And the longer I was up close to those roles, not necessarily those people, because they were all people who I really respected, but I saw their jobs and thought, I don't want to do that job. That job seems terrible. And so kind of those like next future jobs that I was like, maybe I'm qualified for that job. Maybe I could do that job well, but I don't want to do that. Was that something that you experienced as you thought about kind of the role you were in and the roles you could be in that made you think, okay, I want to pivot instead of just finding another step at your institution?
That's a great question. And for me, yes, I definitely agree that there were so many people on campus that I looked up to, and I had some great mentors. The problem, and this, I don't think this is just and it's not necessarily a problem, but in my eyes, nobody was leaving. Mm. And these roles that I thought maybe I could grow into, it dawned on me that, this person's going to be here another 15 years. And if I want to take this next step, then I have to wait for this person to retire or, move on in their career. There wasn't that opportunity that I was looking for. And for me, it was more about the opportunity aspect than it was anything else, because I just didn't see any of these roles opening, and they can only create so many new roles. And I was fortunate and lucky enough to have a couple of new roles created specifically for me, but I just didn't see it really progressing into the senior leadership, which is where I ultimately wanted to be.
Yeah.
That's a great question, Lindsey. When you think about higher education, I think we're all sort of taught at a very young professional age that the culmination of what you want to be is a VPSA or a Chief Student Affairs Officer. And I think that role has drastically changed over the last couple decades. But I think more and more people are realizing that's not necessarily the pathway for them and have to explore these other options, whether that's on campus or off. So as you both were thinking about, maybe those are not the roles that I want, or maybe I don't want to wait that long to wait out some of those people to their retirement, where did you all land when you left higher education? What was your transition out, and what roles were you, and what did that look like?
I can go first on this one, Lindsey. So I think I definitely was not sold on the idea of leaving higher ed altogether. I had been in higher ed for so long, it was so ingrained in me. And I thought, I still have a lot to offer. The problem with even living in Philadelphia, where there are several institutions of higher ed, I just couldn't find that position that fit. And I thought, I don't necessarily want to move across the country to take this job in Oregon or Montana or wherever, because that's me uprooting my entire life. So you know what? Why don't I just start dipping my toe into the water and looking for other opportunities out there? And I saw a role that I thought, you know what? I don't know a ton about what it is to be a true customer success manager in the SaaS world. But I thought, you know what? This opportunity at Microsoft is higher ed adjacent. So I'm going to pursue it. I was fortunate enough to go through the interview process with Microsoft, and thank you. And within just a few short weeks, I ended up accepting a customer success role at Microsoft, and it was a remote position. I was still working with higher ed customers for the most part. So I was still using a lot of the knowledge that I had attained over those 14 years. And it was something that I truly took to. And I thought, you know what, this is something so completely different outside the world of higher ed. I went to work for one of the largest companies in the world with 165,000 employees. And it just was a shoe that fit. And that was more or less my transition out of higher ed. Now, it was not necessarily a quick thing. I definitely explored a lot of opportunities. I submitted a lot of applications and was lucky enough to get the call back from Microsoft. So I don't want to make it seem like, oh, it was so easy just to go out and find that next role and land that next dream position at such a great company. I was very lucky and very fortunate, and was lucky enough to work with a recruiter who saw the skills that I had acquired in higher ed and thought they would transfer nicely into a CS role at Microsoft.
Yeah. All right. Well, I can share my my transition unless you want to continue kind of what that looked like from there, or do you want me to share my transition out?
No, I don't. Why? I would love to hear a little bit more, because we definitely had some different paths leaving higher ed. So I would love to hear a little bit more about yours.
Yeah, like I said, I think I knew that it was time for me to try something else, and I was really committed to um, making a change as relatively quickly, again, knowing that I had really small kids at home and I wanted to see what it might be like to have a little bit more flexibility. And so was looking for remote or hybrid roles. And a little bit differently, I didn't do a ton of applying or, just putting a million applications out. I actually pretty quickly, and kind of my point of realizing I wanted to try something different, learned that there would be a job opening at a local nonprofit that I had a close personal relationship with. And they were needing a chief of staff and director of operations. And a lot of my additional background after my leadership studies doctorate was a huge interest in coaching and kind of personal and team development. And so had done training both in Gallup, Clifton Strengths. And so became a certified strengths coach as well as an Enneagram coach. And so loved utilizing those with teams in the higher ed realm, but of course was hopeful that I could use those certifications and get to incorporate those into my next opportunity. And so thankfully this organization had an interest in both. And so my experience had always been that if people are already kind of interested in those types of tools and training, that is a lot easier than convincing people that they're helpful. And so to go to a situation where people already valued and had some kind of built-in understanding of that was an exciting opportunity that I thought I'd be able to utilize those. And so made a transition. It all did happen pretty quickly, which was also different than a typical higher ed search or transition. So it was just within a few weeks of finding out that position was going to be open, that I made the transition kind of away from my previous life on a campus full time, to working more hybrid, where I was in an office just a couple days a week, and then working from home 2 to 3 days a week. And so it was a big change, but obviously a different context. But my role in the chief of staff role was heavily involved in leading teams, doing kind of different work, which looked pretty similar to my role and my work in higher ed of leading a team of people all kind of owning their own content area. So it was nice to feel like the work that I was doing was similar to some of the work that I had done, putting processes in place, building out systems. So yeah, it was a transition to something that I cared a lot about, but a nonprofit context was totally different. Even though higher ed is technically nonprofit, it's a little different than a small startup. The organization I moved to is only about 5 years old, and so lots to build out. And so that personal connection was kind of the final thing that said, okay, let's try this. Let's make a jump and see what life's like outside of a campus.
And Lindsey, I have a quick question for you. So a chief of staff role on a university campus, if you're interviewing for that position, you have a phone screen, then you have a Zoom call, then you have another phone screen, then you meet the team, then you go spend your day on campus, then you actually get to meet with the person who you're going to be working most closely with.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that was my experience in higher ed.
Sure.
Was that your experience transitioning to a nonprofit?
Not at all. I submitted my application. I had one interview, kind of with a third party, someone that they had asked to kind of help do some interviews, and a conversation with some of the leaders, and heard from them the next day. I was left feeling like there are some questions y'all should have asked me that nobody ever asked me.
And I asked that because I wanted to highlight the stark contrast between interview processes and procedures on a campus compared to even, I was going to say the business world, but the nonprofit outside of higher education world. And with Microsoft, I had one call with a recruiter, and the recruiter said, yeah, I would love to move you to the next round. And that next round consisted of one 15-minute call with the hiring manager, one 15-minute call with my direct manager, and one 15-minute call with somebody else on the team. And within 48 hours, I had a written offer, which was, it absolutely blew my mind, because being in higher ed for so long, you're so inundated with these incredibly complex interview processes for sometimes even coordinator roles.
For sure. That had been my experience as well. That's a great question to show some of the differences in what it looks like when you start a different process in a different space.
As you all were thinking about leaving higher education, can you share a little bit about how your organizations and supervisors or other leadership supported or didn't support that? I know a lot of fear from people in the expat groups on social media is that there's going to be retaliatory action, or that they have to hide it, or there's a level of guilt about leaving students and the work that they had been doing. Can you share how you were or were not able to engage other folks on campus in your decision-making process?
Yeah, sure. I'm currently on a call with the supervisor who I had at the time, so I think we're okay. I think we survived. I think it's interesting because being part of small groups, or people who are in other fields, and sharing about what my process looked like, of even talking with my supervisor, sharing my desire to kind of have a new path. They were truly in shock that I would tell my supervisor I was thinking about finding a different job. And so I think the reality of developmental supervision, which is something we may talk about a little bit more later, just is an aspect of higher ed that is not always the case elsewhere. And so that had been my experience as a supervisor when people had direct reports shared with me, hey, I'm considering a new role, I'm applying for something. Of course, you never, again, to Justin's point, if you lose a staff member, it is no easy thing to replace them. And so you never want to see people go. But I always experience the reality, both as a supervisor and from my supervisor's support in pursuing a new opportunity, and a desire for people to be able to kind of follow their path and realize their potential, whether that was at the institution, within higher ed, or outside higher education. And so I do think that that's a pretty big difference compared to other fields, understandably. I mean, there's some fields that security is a big issue. And so if they realize that someone's on their way out, some things are going to change pretty quickly. But yeah, I experienced a lot of support and even help in, let's look at resumes, let's look at jobs you might be interested in. Some of that's going to be a little bit personal. You may have a supervisor who is not as supportive. But if you do, I think you're going to find that my experience was always a desire to help. And again, I had walked that out with staff members previously. It is a little bit different to think about. I don't recommend or suggest people telling everyone like, hey, I'm looking at leaving. That can create some issues and just some understandable concerns for partners across campus. About the just the fear of, if you're going to leave, well, what's that going to do? And, that can create some issues. And so same for direct reports. I don't personally think it's super appropriate to share a desire to transition with direct reports, again, to create that same anxiety in them. There may be some unique situations where that would be okay. But I always experience a lot of support with supervisors. What about you, Justin?
That's a loaded question. And I unfortunately did not have the level of support that you had. When I told my supervisor that I was leaving, she looked me in the eye and said, I hope you're happy, and never spoke to me again. That was the last interaction that I ever had with one of our senior leaders on campus. And
not to stir up drama, I guess the question would just be, had that been y'all's relationship? Were you surprised by that? Had y'all had a really close relationship up to that point? Or was that kind of what you maybe expected?
And again, we had a great working relationship for a long time. And then there was some restructuring that happened on campus. And when that restructuring happened, there were some cracks that started to form within the relationships of some leaders. And from that time on, it was more or less what I expected. Now, had that been a year previous, that would not have been what I expected at all. Yeah. So at the end of the day, it still worked out fine. I still wish everyone the best. I still had a tremendous staff on campus who I was exceptionally sad to leave, because these were people that I had been working with for a really long time. And the idea of leaving the students, I mean, I know that's something that gets brought up on expat pages all the time, is that so many people have a guilt of leaving their student bodies, their student populations. And I definitely felt that. It was not an easy thing to work through immediately. And then it was even funnier, because that following May, I was like, wow, this is graduation season. And I should be so busy with graduation stuff. And I didn't have those responsibilities, and I didn't get to see all of our students walk down and grab their diplomas. So that was the part of the transition that I found the hardest. And it came several months after I had left. Mm-hmm. It was the nostalgia of realizing that there were these things happening on campus, and they were very regular things, and that I was a part of them for so long, and then was no longer a part of them.
And they just kept happening.
And they still do. And I still think about it. Obviously, it's still something that I think about regularly. I still text my previous coworkers who still work on campus and say, how's graduation? Tell me, was there any really funny stories that happened this year, or, anything like that? But yeah, there's definitely some nostalgia.
For sure.
So we have a question from the chat from Megan. Are there any general roles or skills that you'd consider higher ed adjacent, or you noticed you had really good transferable skills from your time in student affairs?
Yeah, and I can jump on this one really quickly, because for me it was, and I know it's a soft skill, but being on campus, being in higher ed, you have no opportunity to succeed if you are not actively building relationships on a daily basis. And being a customer success manager now, that is essentially what I am doing. Instead of building relationships with the students, I'm now building relationships with businesses, with our administrators from across the country. And for me, that was the most important thing, was realizing that, wow, I had learned this incredible skill to just be able to garner these relationships. And it was something that I didn't necessarily think about on campus on a daily basis. And now it's one of those things where I say, yeah, had I not been on campus, I never would have had this ability. I never would have learned this skill. So I know that's a soft skill, but that's definitely one of the things that I took away above all else, was just the constant need to create relationships using active listening and empathy and being able to relate to people in different circumstances. And it's something that I still do every single day.
Yeah. Yeah, I would fully agree with that. I think maybe a lightning round of them, I would say. I think programming skills are often something that specifically student affairs, but higher ed staff often have, that not every job requires the ability to have skill in planning and executing an event, and therefore marketing. I think that's something that a lot of professions would never do. Team building, whether that's small group facilitation, or whether that's leading students or other colleagues, I think is something that is really valuable to all organizations and something that people don't always have. I personally experienced, and it could have been a transition to a smaller, less structured environment. But I think just familiarity with technology, and with technology to go about programming, connecting, building relationships. I can't necessarily say that I'm super high tech, especially compared to Adam. Adam's very high tech. I don't know how to code or program things, but to just basically use technology is something that not all fields think about, how to use technology to make things more efficient or document things. And so I think that having that skill, being on a campus where you have access to research and utilize some of those systems, is something that I know I was able to kind of bring and say, hey, there's a better way to do this. We can share some calendars and do some things that just basic, office administration that I think is kind of built into a lot of higher ed worlds, is a little bit different. And so those were some specifics. I'm sure there's a whole bunch more that I could think of. Public speaking, I think depending on your role in student affairs, you likely have had opportunities to speak to a whole bunch of different audiences. You're going to share something different with parents and families than you will with first year students, than you will with student leaders, than you might with university administrators. And so depending on what type of experience you've had, both creating presentations, giving pitches, those are all things that I think are pretty common in a higher ed world, that are useful outside of higher ed, and that experience is going to translate. Adam, I think you have a list too, or are you thinking of others, Justin? Now?
Oh, yeah. Well, I just wanted to expand just a tad on a couple of the things that you mentioned. And I think especially in student affairs and higher education, we wear so many hats. We are responsible for not only creating the event or the initiative, whatever it may be, we're also in charge of selling that event to make sure that people are there, to make sure that whatever we are providing is something that they actually want. We are responsible for marketing that event. We are responsible for looking at the data after that event and saying, you know what, let's analyze this and say what worked, what didn't, what could we do better next time, what was the overall, attendance or utilization or what have you. So much of what we do is, and I know at Microsoft, it was very different. You have a marketing department, you have a sales department, you have a customer success department, you have an onboarding department, you have the data analytics. All of those were things that I was doing on campus every single day. And I think it's really important to understand that so many of the skills that we're developing on campus really can be transferred to absolutely anywhere. And specifically with me, it was onboarding. I thought, you know what? I ran orientation for years. This onboarding is essentially just orientation for an administrator, for a business, for a company. And
orientation is important everywhere.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And yeah, we may not call it orientation. We call it onboarding because that's the buzzword these days. But the work, the skill set is the same.
Yeah. And I would even add to that kind of that user experience idea, which again, I think is a little bit more of a tech term, but I think that's something that's built into any student facing job, is thinking about, are you creating an experience, whether it's a co-curricular learning opportunity, whether it's a movie night, it doesn't matter what it is. Again, how you market it and convince people it's going to be, there's a lot of competition on campus. There's, is this worth them coming to? And then making sure they have a good time so that they'll keep coming to things, knowing how to keep something flowing, paying attention to what people need, anticipating those needs. Those are all skills that translate into all sorts of other, it's not always going to be a student activity or a resident, training or, a resident assistant training. We do those things in higher ed all the time. And those things do translate. But it is easy to forget about that and to think about what is the term, sharing the idea of using onboarding versus orientation. If that's something you have experience in, then figuring out how to translate that and how to talk about that, which can even just come from having conversations with friends outside of higher ed and saying, hey, let me tell you the things that I know I'm good at or I've done. What type of terminology do you use in your field to explain these types of activities?
Yeah, because terminology it's so interchangeable. And that was one of the biggest lessons that I learned when leaving higher ed was like, oh yeah, you know what? We call it this on campus, or we call this, X at whatever conference we went to. But now that I'm in this tech world, we call it something else, but it's still the same exact thing.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really important aspect to highlight.
I think you all bring up a lot of good points about roles that a lot of people don't think about. In the expat groups, we hear a lot about, I think I can be a recruiter, or I think I could be a project manager, but there's so much more out there that our skills are transferable to. And thinking about the specializations we even have in student affairs, whether you're a data and assessment person or you are a DEI practitioner, there's so much more out there that I think oftentimes we're limiting ourselves in the kinds of roles or the skills that we think we're bringing to the table.
Yeah, you've made me think too. I'd even add curriculum development, anything like that, program development. Those are all things that if you've even developed a training for your student leaders or for your staff, that those are things that can translate to other spaces.
Yeah, and the key term there is enablement. So when you see an enablement specialist, that person is just teaching somebody else how to use a software, how to use a service, how to use a product. So there are a lot of those terms out there that, again, interchangeability.
So, we talked a little bit about both of your transitions out of higher education and the roles that you've landed into. And coincidentally, as we've been having these conversations about this structured dialogue for this month, both of your organizations made some pretty tough structural decisions. And can you talk a little bit about how that impacted you and how you're doing and what is life like right now for you both?
You or me, Justin? I can't remember whose turn it is.
I'm thinking rock, paper, scissors. I don't mind. I don't mind kicking this one off. I think it's an interesting question and something that we need to think about and we need to discuss is, unfortunately, my previous company laid off a significant number of individuals about a month ago, and I was a casualty, if you will, of those layoffs. So right now I am in a completely new space in my life, and that space is being unemployed. My company did cut a number of people. And when I was in higher education, being unemployed was not something I ever was concerned about. It was, you know what, I have been on this campus for a long time. I know everything there is to know. And it's not necessarily easy to cut jobs in higher education. Now, that's not to say that they don't get cut, because I know that they do. But in the world outside of higher education, it is a pretty regular occurrence. And I have several friends who are in the same boat that I am right now, who had landed terrific jobs at companies outside of higher ed and have unfortunately been impacted by financial decisions made by a company. And that is unfortunately just the reality that we live in. And again, not something that I necessarily ever was concerned with when being in higher ed or on campus. And I could talk about this all day, so I'm going to kick it over to Lindsey.
Yes. Well, similarly, again, not the best coincidences, but our organization, the organization that I was a part of, has come into some struggles, both financial and then structural, of figuring out the right structure to move forward and try to achieve the goals. And while still caring a lot about the mission of the organization, the organization decided that they needed to eliminate my role and find a new structure to kind of move ahead and reach the goals that they had, while facing some financial challenges. And so I'm in that boat as well, an unemployment boat that, again, is something I never dreamed of, with lots of experience and education under my belt. Didn't anticipate that. A truth about me is that I'm somewhat risk averse. And so definitely felt like I was taking, here we are, careful friends, that I was taking a risk and taking a leap, and then to realize kind of some of those maybe fears could be realized, and how those have impacted kind of personal family life as well as professional life and hopes for the future. So definitely a different spot than I thought I would be in at the very beginning of this year, and trying to navigate and hope that all those transferable skills we just discussed will come in handy soon.
Yeah, and one of the transferable skills that I just want to highlight very quickly is just the idea of networking. Networking is actually how Adam and Lindsey and I all recently met. And it is one of those things where I probably didn't do the greatest job networking with people outside of my industry when I was on campus and so ingrained into my day-to-day campus activities. So if there's one thing, whether you want to stay in higher ed for the rest of your career or whether you're thinking about a change, get on LinkedIn, start reaching out to people. You will be shocked with how many people are willing to have a conversation about their career path or about their journey, or just to connect. People, I connect with people, especially now, I connect with people all the time from all over the country, from all different professions. And just to be able to have the opportunity to hear someone's story is something that I value very highly, and something that I always stress to people is so important, is just continue to build your network, whether you want to stay in higher ed forever or whether you're looking for a change.
Looks like there's a question.
We have a quick question from the chat. How long were both of you there before your layoff?
I think about 8 months for me.
I was there 11 months.
Not very long.
No, not very long. And definitely a surprising thing. But I see Chrissy asked a question, is, do you regret leaving higher ed? Lindsey, do you want to take it?
I don't. I think I had, like I said, I think it was a careful choice. It definitely wasn't a quick, rash decision. It wasn't like I got mad at work one day and was like, I'm out of here. Again, as we both shared, a little risk averse, probably too much on the side of, let's make a really cautious calculation. And so, even though my first venture outside of higher ed professionally has not been a long one or been maybe the most successful in terms of longevity, I still feel like the decision to leave was right and the timing was right. Hopeful that the coming months or maybe additional opportunities will allow me to see kind of that looking back path of the places that, the decision points that got me to where hopefully I will end up. But I still believe that choice was the right one. Again, for me, both feeling like that professional change was needed, as well as those personal factors of being able to be, a lot more available for my family in this last season, which has made me committed to trying to find something that would have similar flexibility, which is not necessarily a given, may not be the case. But I think those same reasons that I wanted to leave are still true and still accurate in this current season. Doesn't necessarily mean I would never want to be part of a higher ed institution again. But for now, yeah, I don't regret it. What about you, Justin?
I Mirror exactly what you just said. No, it's not something that I regret. As I mentioned, there is some nostalgia that creeps up on me around some of those big times of the year, like orientation and graduation. But for me, I mean, I was most worried about leaving my staff. I had such a great staff on campus. And the thing is I still keep in touch with all those staff members. So just because I left higher ed and left the institution doesn't mean that I'm abandoning people or leaving these people who I've grown incredibly close with. And that's one thing that I see on Facebook groups and LinkedIn groups all the time is like, I'm thinking about leaving higher ed, but I don't want to leave the people that I'm working with. I don't want to leave the students. And you know what? The people that you're working with are not going to disappear just because you left. And they're not going to resent you just because you left. If they are good people who want to see you grow, they're going to be happy for you and they're going to support you. So it's not something I regret. I think the timing was right. I'm also very risk adverse, so it was a very calculated decision, and it's just not something that I regret.
Yeah.
So we have some questions that have come up as well. So you both have mentioned that it's not necessarily something you regret. Would either of you ever go back to a college campus?
Ever? Maybe. Now, I don't think so. I think that the decisions or the reasons that I wanted to leave are still in place. And so I don't think that that's the best next step for me right now. And when life looks way different, maybe that would feel different. I don't think I have some hatred for higher ed or anything like that, but just I think the opportunity to understand a different type of work reality taught me a lot. And so, yeah.
Again, I couldn't have said it better myself. I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to the perfect opportunity, but whether it's on campus or a business, I don't want to drive into an office every day. And that is one of the things that I have certainly realized in this journey over the last couple of years is that I just don't feel the need to be in an office every day. So if the perfect opportunity came up, I would certainly entertain it. But right now, probably not.
So we also had somebody ask, what advice do you have for a higher ed newbie, less than 2 years in the field, who already knows they don't want to stay? What advice do you have for them to start thinking about what transitioning would look like?
Sure. I think a couple things are come to mind quickly. One, I think, is to recognize how much you've probably learned quickly, as Justin and I both talked about. You probably wear a lot of hats, especially as a newer employee. You may be, helping and supporting multiple functional areas. And so you've likely learned a lot. So I would spend some time thinking about how those transition and may equate to similar experience as other places. Interestingly, I think that sometimes being a little bit newer in the field, there are a lot of entry-level roles outside of higher ed that you're probably qualified for, that may have some bonuses and benefits that aren't necessarily true to your current role in higher ed. So I think sometimes it can be a little bit harder if you're maybe not a newer professional to think about making a transition into another field that you don't have experience in and where you're likely not a great candidate for an entry-level role. People may have some different opinions about that, but I think somebody who has been a supervisor, been a thought leader, been a lot of those things, is probably not the best fit for an entry-level role. And so I think it does make your job search a little bit different, but I wouldn't say that there's anything wrong with that. And you may find an easier path out into a more comparable or lateral shift outside of higher ed. Justin?
So mine's twofold, and one is something I've already mentioned. It's start networking, start having conversations, just talk to people, have conversations about what they do on a day-to-day basis, whether they like their job. Could be it could be anything from accounting to costume design on a movie set. Talk to people, figure out what that next step might look like, and just have conversations. The other thing that I always tell people is that I think everybody in the world should have a sales role at some point in their life. And you can transition into an entry-level sales role almost at any point in your career. And within that sales role, you will be inundated with so many different people from across the organization. You'll learn what different departments do and how they interact. So it's never a bad thing to say, you know what, maybe I'll take this entry-level sales role. And they can be very lucrative. They can also be a real pain in the neck, but you will get exposed to a lot of different professions in the course of just that. So I know that is not what everybody wants to hear, but it's always something that I tell people.
I think the other thing that if you're newer in your career that you can be more open to is so many larger organizations like your Googles, your Metas, etc., have these entry-level rotational programs to give you exposure to multiple areas of the business, that if you're already at a director level or an executive director, you may not be willing to do that or take that kind of cut. But if you're more of an entry-level higher education professional, it's still probably going to be a salary increase, but it's also going to give you the exposure to understand where does your passion fit in a non-higher education world. And so when you see those rotating programs come up, oftentimes it's a very small application window, and it's for a year or two, and then they'll place you in a role within the organization that makes the most sense based on need and skill set. That's something I think more people should think about if you know early on that you're interested in potentially pivoting out of campus. We'll go to another question from the chat, specifically regarding LinkedIn. And we do have a LinkedIn session later this month all about how to utilize LinkedIn. But curious if either of you have advice or a go-to message you send on LinkedIn when you want to connect. The first message can be intimidating.
I'm gonna defer to the expert here, Justin. This is I'm not the wealth of knowledge here. You go.
Yeah, no problem. So the thing that everyone needs to understand about LinkedIn is that there are a lot of people on it. And if you send a message to somebody and they don't respond, so what? It's part of everything that we do, not only in higher ed, outside of higher ed. Sometimes we send messages to people and they don't respond. And that's okay. And guess what? You are no worse off because of that. Then you could send that same exact message to the next person, and that next person could turn into a lifelong mentor. So I fully understand and appreciate how intimidating it can be to send those initial messages. And it does come with a little bit of practice. Once you send one, then it gets a whole lot easier to send that second one. And then the third one becomes something you don't even think about. So it's really like jumping into the cold plunge. It's just like, you just got to do it. And once you start, you'll realize, and this is something that I've realized, and I think I mentioned already, there are so many people out there who are willing to help and who want to see other people succeed. You will find those people in the course of just reaching out to them on LinkedIn. I mean, again, the three of us on this call today, Adam and Lindsey, know one another for a long time, but somebody tagged me on a post and Adam and I started chatting. So it's really that easy to just reach out to someone, and all you have to do is say, you know what? Hi, I'm Justin. I would love to talk to you a little bit about X, Y, and Z. Let me know if you have some time to talk. And it can be that simple. And if you don't hear back from them, so what?
What I always tell my coaching clients is that LinkedIn is not your friend group. It's not meant to be utilized in such a close way, right, that it's meant to expand your network, provide opportunities by posting, by commenting on different things that people post, following trends that you are interested in. It doesn't have to feel as personal as I think a lot of times the higher education industry specifically makes it feel. And so I would say don't be intimidated by the random message, the outreach. Now, you don't want to necessarily just go through a list and try to connect with everyone,
right,
but try to have some sort of strategy. So we are just about out of time. But before we wrap up, I just want to extend a heartfelt thank you to you both. Your insights, experience, candor about your personal stories and situations, I think have really enriched the conversation. And I think this is a perfect way to kick off the month of webinars and workshops and masterclasses, because really, again, it's about that decision making and the risk and how risk averse you are, and thinking about what the future may hold off campus. So how can people contact you in the future if they're interested in continuing the conversation?
Before I share that, I did want to share one other thing that I thought of as you were just mentioning that, Adam, as I shared being risk averse. I think just a point of hopefully truth is that you are not your job, and that you will still be the same person whether you don't have a job, turns out, or have a different job, that higher ed may be a huge aspect of who you are or who you used to be, and that can still be really beautiful and fulfilling. But I think sometimes in higher ed, we make our jobs so much of who we are, not in a bad way, but that it can feel like an enormous decision. And it is, but just that encouragement that you will still be you, regardless of what you decide, whether that's to stay in higher ed or try something else. So you're not your job. So if you want to connect, LinkedIn is a great way to connect. There you go, Adam, perfectly timed. Happy to connect. And I think Justin also is similarly willing.
LinkedIn. Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to reach out. I am always open to a conversation. And obviously, as I've said over and over, I use LinkedIn quite a bit. So please don't hesitate to reach out, say hello, introduce yourselves, and connect if you want. I just put my, sorry, go ahead, Adam.
I was just going to say, we'll make sure that when we send out the email to everyone who registered, that we'll include Lindsey and Justin's LinkedIn links for you all. So practice connecting with strangers on LinkedIn, and go ahead and give them a connection. So thank you both again. We have quite a few more opportunities to engage with folks during the course of the month. And so I wanted to share with everyone our schedule. This is going to allow you to take advantage of what you'd like. Just like this one, these will be broadcast live, both through the StreamYard platform as well as on YouTube, and the recordings will be made available to view later. Each one promises to be engaging and informative as this one. We have panels, workshops, masterclasses. So thank you again for joining us. And thank you again to Justin and Lindsey for taking the time out of their day to have this conversation. We really appreciate people interacting and engaging during the webinar. So thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah, appreciate it all.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Lindsey. This was such a great conversation. I hope we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, for sure.
Have a great rest of your week.
Thank y'all.
Take care, everyone.